There is a word Herbert Kickl uses to describe himself. Volkskanzler. People's Chancellor. It sounds almost humble. Folksy. A man of the people. But that word has a history. In Nazi propaganda, Volkskanzler was the title they reserved for Adolf Hitler. Kickl's campaign team knew exactly what it carried, and they used it anyway. That tells you something about the moment Austria finds itself in. Because here is the number that should stop you. A party led by that man, a man dismissed from the Interior Ministry partly at the request of Austria's own intelligence services over his perceived ties to Russia, is now polling at 38%. Not 38% of some fringe, 38% of the entire Austrian electorate. The highest figure the Freedom Party has reached in its 70-year history. And the government built specifically to keep him out of power? It is sitting on a trapdoor. Today we ask a simple question, with very complicated answers. What actually happens to Austria, to its economy, and to Europe if Herbert Kickl walks through that door? This is the Veritas Brief. Welcome to the Veritas Brief from Veritas Europea, a slow journalism take on European and world affairs. We don't chase the headlines. We take one story that matters and give it the time it actually deserves. The history, the numbers, and the consequences most coverage races right past. I'm your host, and today we're in Austria, a country in its third straight year of recession, with a far-right party at a record high and a governing coalition running out of room. We're asking what a Herbert Kickl chancellorship would really mean for the nation, its economy, and the European Union it sits at the heart of. Let's get into it. Let's go back 16 months to March 2025, when Chancellor Christian Stocker of the center-right People's Party, the ÖVP, took the oath of office. The Austrian political establishment exhaled. It had taken 5 months of negotiation, the longest in the history of the Second Republic, to build a three-party coalition: the Conservatives, the Social Democrats, and the liberal Neos. The center had held, barely. That word, barely, is doing a lot of work, and it is worth sitting with. Because the coalition wasn't built around a shared vision. It was built around a shared fear. The entire architecture of that government existed to do one thing: exclude the party that had actually won the most votes in September 2024. To keep Herbert Kickl out of the chancellery. And here's the problem with building a government around exclusion. Exclusion is not a program. It is not an answer to a cost of living crisis. It is not a jobs plan. It is a wall, and walls on their own do not govern. So where do things stand now? The three governing parties combined are polling at roughly 48%. That is a whisker above a majority and well below any margin of comfort. The cracks are everywhere. Take the EU Wage Transparency Directive. The Social Democrats back it, the Conservatives and the Liberals oppose it. Budget fights multiply week by week. And every single time those internal divisions widen on the front pages, the Freedom Party gains another point. We want to be precise about the mechanism here because it matters. The coalition's defining decision to shut Kickl out did not weaken him. It made him. It handed him the most powerful story in politics: the outsider, the only honest man, kept from power by a comfortable establishment that is cutting your pension while it does it. And that story works. It works especially well when it happens to be partly true. To understand why Kickl is winning, you have to understand the ground he is standing on. And that ground is an economy that has been contracting for 3 straight years. Austria entered recession in 2022, and it has not left. The Austrian Institute of Economic Research confirmed in 2025 that this is the country's 3rd consecutive year of contraction, the longest downturn since Austria reconstituted itself as a sovereign state after the Second World War. The economy shrank by 1.1% in 2024 alone. Residential construction fell 18% in 2 years. Unemployment is climbing from under 6% toward a projected 7.5%. The causes are partly structural, partly international. High energy costs, labor costs that run above Germany and Austria's Central European competitors, weak export demand, the broader European slowdown. The European Commission projects Austria's deficit will stay above 4% of GDP through 2027, with debt climbing toward 85% of GDP. Austria, once a byword for fiscal conservatism, now carries a structural problem no single election can fix. Now here is where economics becomes politics. The coalition's answer to all of this was austerity. 15 billion euros in spending cuts across 2025 and 2026. On paper, it satisfies the EU's fiscal rules. In practice, it transfers the pain directly onto exactly the voters most receptive to the Freedom Party's message. Think about what that looks like at the kitchen table. Pension increases that trail inflation by more than a full percentage point. The suspension of inflation-linked family benefits. And a new healthcare access fee landing on people's health cards in November of this year. So picture an Austrian family opening that statement in November, seeing a new fee where there wasn't one before. Which party has spent 2 years promising to shrink the state's reach into their wallet, not expand it? They don't have to think hard to remember. The austerity meant to save the coalition may be the very thing feeding its rival. Let's pause for just a moment. What you're listening to right now is slow journalism. We don't chase breaking news, and we don't write for algorithms. We take an 18-minute story, and we give it the room it actually needs. The history behind a single word, the arithmetic behind a campaign promise, the second-order consequences most coverage skips right past. We can do that for one reason. We are funded directly by you, our readers and listeners. Fully independent, ad-lite, no billionaire owner, no corporate agenda. Just analysis that answers to the people who read it. If you value this kind of work, unhurried, high-context reporting on European and world affairs, we'd ask you to support it. It costs €2 a week. That's it. €2 to help keep independent European journalism alive and genuinely independent. You can subscribe at veritaseuropea.eu. That's veritaseuropea.eu. Escape the breaking news noise. Come think with us instead. Now, back to Austria and the question of what Kickl would actually do. So let's say Kickl wins. What is the economic plan? On its face, it's a familiar populist menu, and each item is individually popular. Cut corporate tax from 23% to 20%. Raise the income tax-free allowance so workers keep more of their pay. Abolish the CO2 carbon levy. Pledge no new taxes at all. Lower employer labor costs. Raise the retirement age to 67, with incentives to work longer. Sounds appealing. Now here's the catch, and it's a big one. How do you pay for all of it? This is where the plan rests on one load-bearing pillar: remigration. The Freedom Party argues that removing asylum seekers and restricting who can claim minimum income and social assistance could cut government spending by up to €627 million a year. Stack that with other cuts, and the party's internal math claims a path to a balanced budget that still leaves room for tax cuts. Their headline savings target is €24 billion by 2028. We need to be honest about that arithmetic, because independent economists and EU fiscal monitors are not convinced. Consider what's being promised simultaneously. Cut taxes, introduce no new revenue, abolish a carbon levy worth roughly €1 billion a year, and meet the EU's deficit reduction requirements. To square that circle, you need a volume of spending cuts the Freedom Party has simply not specified in detail. One market liberal think tank, broadly sympathetic to the party, called the program viable, but only under certain assumptions. And that phrase, certain assumptions, is carrying an enormous amount of weight. Remember, the Commission projects Austria's deficit above 4%, with the current coalition's austerity already in place. A government that then cuts corporate taxes and scraps the carbon levy faces an even steeper climb, not a gentler one. And abolishing that carbon levy has a second-order consequence that rarely makes the campaign poster. Austria is committed to the EU Green Deal, which structures investment, industrial subsidies, and regulatory alignment across the entire bloc. Dismantle your carbon pricing unilaterally, and you don't just lose $1 billion in revenue. You create friction with Brussels, you risk infringement proceedings, and you signal to every European industrial partner that Austria's regulatory environment now carries political risk. That is the kind of signal that quietly raises the cost of capital for an entire country. Now we come to the piece that alarms Austria's allies more than any tax cut ever could: Russia. No single part of the Freedom Party's agenda generates more concern abroad. The party signed a formal friendship agreement with Vladimir Putin's United Russia Party back in 2016. Kickl campaigned in 2024 on lifting EU sanctions against Russia, resuming Russian gas imports, and ending Austrian support for Ukraine, a country he called corrupt. And the timing of this is strategically awkward, to put it mildly, because Austria is moving in the opposite direction. The national energy company, OMV, terminated its long-standing gas contract with Gazprom in December 2024. The EU's roadmap aims to eliminate all remaining Russian gas across the bloc by 2027. Austria's entire energy infrastructure is actively reorienting away from the very dependency Kickl wants to revive. So a Freedom Party government chasing sanctions relief in Russian gas would be swimming against two currents at once: Austria's own strategic direction and a binding EU-level process. And it would be doing it while Austria is already under fiscal scrutiny from Brussels. Here's where the exposure really multiplies. If Kickl, as Chancellor, joins Hungary's Viktor Orbán and Slovakia's Robert Fico in blocking the renewal of EU sanctions on Russia, Austria stops being a reliable EU partner and becomes a structural obstacle inside the bloc's foreign policy. The Freedom Party reaches for Austria's tradition of neutrality as cover, the idea that neutrality demands equal distance between NATO and Russia. But we'd put it plainly. That argument sounded principled in 1955. It looks very different in 2026, when Russia is waging an active war of aggression against a neighboring European state. Even Austria's former foreign minister, Alexander Schallenberg, no progressive, called Kickl a concrete security risk for the country's intelligence community and its diplomatic partnerships. And this brings us to the largest point, the one that reaches well beyond Austria's borders. The Freedom Party does not operate alone. It is a founding member of Patriots for Europe, now the largest far-right grouping in the European Parliament. The network includes Orbán's Fidesz, Germany's AfD, Marine Le Pen's National Rally, and Geert Wilders' party in the Netherlands. At the Freedom Party's 70th anniversary event in Vienna, Orbán, Weidel, and Wilders stood on the same stage as Kickl. The whole point of that staging was a declaration. The European hard right no longer behaves as a scatter of isolated national parties. It functions as a coordinated network. For Austria, that alignment cuts two ways. On one hand, it gives a country of 9 million people real strategic weight inside a cross-border bloc with serious numbers in the parliament. On the other, it subordinates Austrian interests to an agenda driven largely by Orbán's Hungary, a country that has spent 15 years dismantling judicial independence and press freedom, while still collecting billions in EU funds. But here's the insight we want to leave you with, because it's the one most coverage misses. If the Freedom Party governs Austria, it doesn't just add one more voice at EU Council meetings, it adds a veto. The same veto Hungary already wields over Ukraine aid, over rule of law conditions for EU money, over sanctions renewal. And an Austrian veto is not the same as a Hungarian one. Budapest's isolation costs Brussels political capital. It's an irritant. But Austria sits at the crossroads of Western and Central Europe. It's a financial hub. It's embedded in European energy infrastructure. Hungary's defection is a headache. Vienna's defection could break functional policy. That is the real stakes question here. Not simply whether one country lurches right, but whether the entire EU machinery for foreign policy, for sanctions, for cohesion, can keep working with a second, far more central veto holder sitting at the table. So let's bring it back to where we started, to that word, Volkskanzler. Austria's coalition was built around a single act of exclusion. It kept Kickl from the chancellery, and it told itself that was enough. But exclusion was never a vision, and 16 months of austerity have hollowed out whatever goodwill the center had left. 38% is not a protest, it's a trajectory. What we'd ask you to hold on to is this. The question is no longer really whether Austria is on the edge. The polling, the recession, the fracturing coalition, they've already told us that. The question is what lies on the other side of that edge. For Austrian households opening their bank statements, for Austria's place in Europe, and for an EU that may soon find a second veto pointed at its own foreign policy. We'll be watching it closely, and we'll keep giving it the time it deserves. This has been the Veritas Brief. Our work is independent, and it's funded by you. If today's episode was worth your time, support it at veritaseuropea.eu, €2 a week. Until next time, keep thinking slowly.